Very glad to be with you today. And my happiness is that I share this webinar, which is a part of series of webinars introduced by Professor Elkarfa, whom I would like to thank for his initiative. And today, of course, will be on learning-centered. And I would like to introduce Professor Karima BELGHITI, our professor, who is, and whom you know, great guest in this study. My gratitude goes to Professor Slawi, the coordinator of this module, or this master, sorry. And I would like also to thank all my colleagues, my students who are here, and forgive me if I have forgotten somebody. From the very beginning, I've enjoyed being with you. I think this initiative is applauded because it allows some kind of communication between us and our students. Of course, it's scientific academic aspects. Today, of course, the floor will be shared by Professor Elkarfa and Professor Karima BELGHITI. If you don't mind, I will give the floor to. Do you hear me?
Sorry, we cannot hear you, Professor.
Really?
Yes, yes.
We cannot hear you.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Now
Sir.
it's okay.
Have you heard me before? No?
Now it's okay.
So once again, I reiterate my thanks to Professor Elkarfa, to Professor Slawi, the coordinator of this master program, to all the colleagues who are here, to participants, of course, of today, Professor Karima BELGHITI, our friend, colleague, and more, Professor Elkarfa, of course, who is going. And the title, of course, is about learning-centered. The floor is yours. Who would like to begin? Ladies first, I think. Professor Karima BELGHITI.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, of course, Karima. Go ahead. Yes.
So thank you, Professor Sandeep, for your introduction.
Karima, we cannot hear you, please. We cannot hear.
Professor BELGHITI, can you activate your mic?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes,
because I'm going to mute everyone except the speaker.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I was saying that I would like to thank Professor Sandeep for introducing me. That it's an honor that he's doing introducing me today. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Professor Elkarfa, once again for giving me the opportunity for a second time to be part of these webinars, which are to me a knowledge sharing experience par excellence for us and for the students. Thank you, Professor Slawi, the coordinator of the MA program. I think that these webinars are actually a good example of how the learning-centered approach can be practiced and implemented. They are for the students and mostly by the students. Students are at the heart of the whole process. Everything is tailored for them to learn, to construct their own knowledge along the way, to show that they're autonomous, responsible, active learners. It's been very interactive and very engaging. The students are taking a lot of initiatives, asking questions, interacting with their peers, discussing the issues addressed. It's a great experience, learning experience for them and for us as well. So thank you once again, Professor Elkarfa, for giving me the opportunity of taking part and being part of this learning experience. It's an experience to remember and to look up to as well. I will start by sharing my. I need to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Professor.
Yes.
We can
Okay.
see it.
Yes.
So today's issue, as I mentioned earlier, is the sorry. So today's issue, as I mentioned, is the learning-centered approach. This is the outline of my presentation. I'll start with a brief introduction, then I will move on into discussing the relationship between the learning-centered approach and the constructivist theory. Then explaining, sorry for the typos, the relationship again between the learning-centered approach and the learning approaches. I would go briefly over the characteristics of the approach. Then I will provide a synthesis of research that I conducted on my own and mostly with my professors and colleagues, focusing mainly on the extent to which the learning-centered approach has been implemented and used, either for the purpose of developing certain skills or for the purpose of effectively teaching and learning some courses. And then I will end up, of course, with providing a conclusion. These two quotations by Rogers and by Professor Rakim, to me, they summarize everything pretty much that the learner-centered approach is about. Rogers says that learning involves both mind and feelings, whose essence is meaning. The teacher-learner relationship is to be personalized and humanized. Learners must be made aware that they live in a time where the goal of education is no longer the pursuit of static knowledge, but a reliance on process, where the only man who is educated is the man who has learned how to learn. Professor Rakim states that good teachers have to be aware of their students' needs and purposes, sensitive to their students' perceptions of the course, and adapt their teaching and assessment methods accordingly. Our attention should be on the quality of learning, not simply on how to improve the techniques of teaching. As a starting point, I think it's very important to note that the learning-centered approach came or emerged as a reaction to the dissatisfaction with the teacher-centered approach.
Sorry, Professor BELGHITI, we can't hear you well. The quality of the sound is low.
I don't know what I can do.
Yeah, now it's good. Now it's good.
Is it fine now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So what was the problem with the teacher-centered approach? There was an assumption that what is learned is what is taught, no more, no less, and what is taught was expected to be reproduced. The teacher was the only source or is the only source of knowledge. The teacher is the only authority. Learner is passive. The learner is passive. Consumer is a passive consumer of knowledge, and there's a lot of focus on rote learning and memorization. Now, to track back how the shift from the teacher-centered approach to the learner-centered approach, or to the learning-centered approach happened, it is important to understand how things evolved along the way from the beginning. Now, for example, in the teacher-centered approach, there was a lot of focus on lecturing. There was a lot of focus on direct instruction, demonstration, rote learning, as I mentioned earlier, and the teacher was the only source of knowledge. Then came the humanistic approaches, which stirred the focus on the learner to some extent, and to communication a lot. So their focus was on maximizing students' talk time, the use of some teaching aids to cater for some learning styles. Everything was still overly teacher-led and controlled. Then came the shift to the learning-centered approach as a result of the rising awareness of the importance of the learner as a human being with needs and expectations and concerns that need to be addressed and provided for, and focus on the process of learning and how through monitoring it we can foster and improve both teaching and learning. And this is what Stevik pretty much says. The awareness of acknowledging a third party, the learner, as being a whole person with intellect and feelings, is as a being and as being an integral part in the teaching and learning process. So the shift on learners implies asking questions. Who are they? What do they need, like to learn? How do they learn? Can they learn what is taught? How can the teaching practices enhance their learning? Are they actually learning or not? More focus on the learning-centered approach started arising with the evolving education scenarios, with the use of ICT, and then in the shift to online learning, etc., the use of innovative pedagogies, etc. In the Moroccan education system, research, or LLC, the learning-centered approach, has been the focus of research among many specialists and experts in the field. And research on the approach has been focusing on the applicability of it. To what extent can it be applicable? To its implementation, there was focus on its implementation and use, to what extent it can be implemented and used. And research also focused on the learning-centered approach as a prerequisite for the development, teaching, or assessment of certain skills, for example, critical thinking, or the implementation of different forms of teaching like e-learning or online learning, or as a prerequisite for the implementation and use of certain teaching methods like group-based projects. As far as the reforms of the education system in Morocco, the learning-centered approach was stressed upon in different past reforms: the National Charter of Education for Education and Training, the Emergency Plan, and it is focused upon most recently now with by the new bachelor system of education. These are just a few quotations taken from the strategic vision of the reform 2015 through 2030, which all highlight the focus on the learning-centered approach. In terms of pedagogical approaches, the one opted for is the learner-centered. For example, it says here the shift from a logic of linear transmission of knowledge and memorization to that of learning and developing critical thinking, engaging in personal growth and development, the acquisition of languages, knowledge, civic values, and digital technologies skills, promoting the transition from a knowledge-consuming society to a society that produces knowledge, focus the pedagogical relationship on the interaction with learners and among them, encouraging initiative and innovation, effort, and pedagogical autonomy. For the curriculum, there's a lot of focus on it to be, or there's a lot of recommendations for it to be varied, innovative, with the involvement of the learner. It says here again, consider the learner as a real partner by involving him in teamwork, assigning him research, innovation, and management tasks, and helping him develop a sense of belonging and duty towards the institution. As for assessment, there's focus on it to be formative and diagnostic, and all these are actually characteristics of the learning-centered approach. Overall, there's a lot of focus on the approach as a prerequisite again for developing active autonomous learning, responsible learning, self-directed learning, as a prerequisite for urgent initiative taking, developing critical thinking skills, problem solving. These skills are actually required for recruitments, for example, in MA programs or in doctoral programs, and also at the level of prestigious scholarships and mobility programs. There is a high level of competitiveness in such programs and scholarships, and they usually target students who are endowed with such skills or those who are likely to develop those skills. These skills are also required in the job market. They are what we call employability skills. Now, we cannot talk about the learning-centered approach without talking about the constructivist theory, whereby good teaching is believed to be based on constructive alignment or aligned teaching, which supports the learning-centered approach a lot. It is based on the notion of allowing students to discover underlying meanings and to construct, build knowledge by themselves and in their own way through relevant learning activities. For this to happen, Biggs 2003 explains that there should be aligned teaching. And aligned teaching involves consistency between all the components of the teaching process. But what he means here is that there should be consistency between the objectives of the course, the teaching methods used, and the assessment techniques used. And if you remember, I talked about this in the presentation about assessment. How before deciding on what to assess, we need to determine the objectives, the why, and then the criteria, the what, and then the how. Aligned teaching also involves making sure that the approach used is aligned with the method and the technique used in class. Again, the why, the what, and the how. For example, if the approach that I'm using is learning-centered approach, and if one of the objectives of my course is to foster students' collaboration in problem solving, for example, the method I would opt for would be collaborative learning, and then the technique I would opt for would be group or pair discussion like snowballing or think, pair, share, etc. So the why, the what, the why, and the how must be aligned. And just a side note for students, because sometimes the terms approach, method, and technique, sometimes they are used interchangeably, and it shouldn't be the case. The approach is the general underlying theory or model about the nature of language, the nature of language learning and teaching. The method is the plan for how to practice, for how to present language and practice it in terms of teaching and learning, which is usually based on the selected approach. And then the technique is the specific activities and tasks practiced in class, and which should be consistent with the method and with the approach chosen. As for the relationship between the learning-centered approach and learning approaches, according to Ramsden, the quality of teaching is related to students' learning outcomes. For him, good teaching supports and helps students to be more productive and perform better
As such, for him again, good teaching is an extended awareness of the relationship between learning and teaching, how both they can affect each other and how both they can drive each other. So there's a close relationship between the teacher's approaches to teaching and the students' approaches to learning, what the teachers do to teach and what the students do to learn. For example, according to Biggs, if a teacher only focuses on what he does without involving the student or without taking into consideration the student needs, expectations, etc., and if he only focuses on transmitting knowledge, students are more likely to adopt what he calls a surface approach to learning, and they would focus on the reproduction or the reiteration of knowledge, which implies again the use of what he calls surface learning strategies. If the teacher, however, adopts for a learning-centered approach to teaching, the students are more likely to adopt a deep approach to learning and focus on deeper understanding of the materials they're studying, which implies, again, the use of deep learning strategies. This is just a brief comparison between the teacher-centered and the learning-centered approaches in terms of teaching, learning, the student's role, the knowledge, is it constructed, is it transmitted, assignments and assessment. For teaching, for example, when it is learner-centered or student-centered, it should be varied, critical thinking oriented, collaborative and interactive. The teacher's role is more of a facilitator, a guide, a co-learner. In a teacher-centered approach, however, everything is lecture-based. There's a lot of focus on note-taking, the worksheets, etc. There's focus on knowledge transmission. The teacher is the main source of knowledge. He's the manager. He's the conveyor of knowledge. Learning in the student-centered is problem-centered. It takes into consideration the learner's needs, preferences are addressed. It is active, it focuses on fostering autonomy, peer dialogue, knowledge generation, etc. In the teacher-centered, the students are considered as homogeneous. There's no differences in terms of needs and level. Passive learning and transmission of information are focused on, no interaction at all in class, and no interconnection of the subjects taking place. For the student's role in the learner-centered, it is active, responsible, he is autonomous. On the other side, though, he's passive and very dependent on the teacher. Knowledge is constructed in the learner-centered approach. In the teacher-centered approach, it is very transmitted, mainly transmitted and reiterated. Assignments focus on authentic tasks, challenging. They promote critical thinking and teamwork. In the teacher-centered, the tasks focus on accuracy, correctness, and they're usually done individually. Assessment in the learner-centered approach or in the student-centered approach, they are usually continuous and they trigger critical thinking. On the other side, it's very cumulative and based on memorization and a reiteration of information. What we can deduce is that the learning-centered approach is very responsive to the learner's needs and expectations. There is less rigidity in the implementation of the syllabus from the part of the teacher. There's a lot of flexibility and adaptation along the way. The teacher provides or uses varied and innovative resources and materials to cater for different students' needs and learning styles. The materials, according to Krashen, are appealing, challenging, varied, and authentic. Materials which are too simple may not be challenging enough for the students and may not urge them to build their own knowledge. If they are not appealing to the students, they won't feel, or the students won't feel motivated and engaged to do the tasks they're involved in. And if the materials are not authentic or the tasks are not authentic, the students won't feel or won't see the link between what they are learning and what they want to use their learning for, which also affects motivation and level of engagement in class. Learning-centered approach also promotes responsibility sharing. There is a lot of involvement of the learner in the learning process and the teaching process and assessment process. It's a way of making the student responsible for his own learning and making him or her aware of the role of their role in the classroom and in the learning process. There's a more tolerant attitude towards error making as a way to address students' fear of making mistakes and insecurity in class, which usually makes a lot of students reluctant to participate in class. It involves and fosters collaborative work between the students via different methods and techniques. And last but not least, it promotes problem solving and critical thinking skills. And according to Ruggiero, the development of critical thinking does not really depend on what is taught, but rather on how it is taught. So the ultimate aim would be to always start from, build upon, and provide for the learner's needs to make students aware of how they learn and how they can learn better, to develop in students a new attitude towards the learning process and work on changing their mindsets and their perceptions of learning, to understand that learning is not about stocking and accumulating knowledge and reiterating it. It's rather about constructing knowledge, and to maximize interaction and engagement in class. So overall, it's a way, the aim is to make learning a driving force for teaching, and teaching a driving force for learning through monitoring, learning through a lot of diagnosis on what students need to learn, how they learn, etc. The teachers are usually able to teach better, and thus they are able, or they will help students learn better. Now, I'd like to share a synthesis of the research conducted mostly with my professors and colleagues. The research was revolved around different issues where the learning-centered approach was focused on as a prerequisite either for the development of certain skills, mainly critical thinking, and for effective teaching and learning of some courses, such as the research methodology course in the Department of English. Now, based on the findings, I'll be reflecting on the extent to which the learning-centered approach has been implemented and used in terms of teaching, learning, knowledge, assignments, and tasks, and then assessment. So in terms of teaching, according to the findings, there was a lot of awareness about what the learning-centered approach is from the part of the teachers, and these are actually testimonies from different teachers. For example, here students understand and get the how and why of things. They do not simply reiterate the information given by the professor. Even in courses involving lecturing, lectures can be interactive, teachers asking questions and making the student think. So all of these testimonies support the extent to which teachers are aware of what the learning-centered approach is, what it requires, and what it entails. In terms of needs analyses, it was found that it was usually done in a very informal way by a few teachers. The level of students and previous knowledge were also elicited in an informal way by some teachers. The teaching practices reflect actually the degree of awareness of about the learning-centered approach. They were varied. Their use, though, depended on the level of studies. Is it the BA, is it the MA, the course objectives, the extent to which the teacher focused on interaction and the level of students' engagement in class. There was film screening, reader theater, the use of questioning, oral activities, presentations, debates, role playing, photo, voice, and video analyses as a whole class and group work, tasks, group-based projects, mainly research projects conducted in groups, writing essays or paragraphs based on photos or videos, and different fun writing tasks done as a whole class in some composition classes at the level of the BA. Lectures and deductive teaching was still common though. For feedback and error correction, the frequency of feedback depended on the frequency of the assignments, how many times the students were given assignments, and the number of assignments that were submitted back by the students. And we know that at the level of the BA, the undergrad level, few students usually submit their assignments to receive feedback on. For the frequency of error correction, it usually depended on the nature of the course. Sometimes it was done explicitly in a direct way that focuses on the form, but it was usually in cases where the error hindered communication. Error correction was also done in an implicit way, sometimes by drawing the student's attention to negative transfer from L1 or sometimes even French. There was a lot of, or a few actually attempts to involve students in whole class editing to proofread their classmates' assignment. It was actually an implicit and inductive way of teaching different elements like punctuation, capitalization, fragments, run-on sentences, etc. The process was done in a very informative way. The students were urged to find and spot the mistakes on their own, and they were urged to suggest ways for correcting the mistakes. There were a few attempts to involve students in peer review and editing. That was mainly observed among some composition classes at the undergrad level, but we don't know how this is effective. Did it actually help the students or not? We don't know. Were the students actually correcting mistakes? Were they correcting what was initially correct? We don't know. There's still research needed. Research is still needed to be conducted on the effectiveness of peer editing. For learning, as far as the learning approaches and strategies, there was a mix of deep surface, active, passive, but what it was common though was the surface learning approaches and strategies, and the passive and over reliance attitude of students. And some of the factors that that emerged as to explain these was the level of motivation of the students and the learning strategies and the teaching approach. And the way the students are used to learn can affect whether or not they would opt for either a deep or a surface approach to learning. Students' motives and objectives. Why are they studying what they're studying, and what is their objective afterwards? What are these motives and objectives? Urge the students to work hard and make efforts were very significant in the findings of the research conducted. And it was actually found that the major itself is very important. The choice of the major is very important. Why did the students choose the major? Was it a choice or a last resort? Does it meet, and if it was a choice, does it meet their expectations and needs? Do they know what they can do with that major after? Do they have a lot of chances with that major? So these can affect to a large extent the amount of efforts devoted and the will to invest in one's own learning and improving it. For active learning, whether or not it was active or not, it depended again on the level of studies and the class size. The level of participation, for example, the level of in English and the self-efficacy would affect the extent to which the students would participate. The extent to which the students are ready for class, did they do their assigned readings or not, did they do their practice exercises or not, would affect that as well. For the tasks and activities, it was mainly observed that that the students would be relatively more engaged and motivated in cases where the ICT is used and where group work and whole class practice are used. For knowledge, was it constructed or was it transmitted? There were attempts
of urgent knowledge construction using the activities and tasks that I mentioned earlier, and other tasks like noticing tasks in grammar classes or advanced organizing and argument mapping. They usually revolve around the teacher generating ideas and building on the student's knowledge, and then step by step through a process of a lot of asking questions. He takes them and guides them throughout a process of a lot of reasoning and analyses to the point where they can actually construct their knowledge. Other sources were used other than the teacher, of course, ICD, experts. Sometimes some teachers and some experts are called into classes. Peers again, but still a lot of research need to be done to know that the extent to which their involvement as a source is actually working or is effective. Knowledge transmission is still common because of different reasons, like the over-reliance, the tendency of over-relying on the teacher, and the extent to which, again, the students are ready for class, among other factors. For the assignments and tasks at the BI level, usually few assignments are submitted, and sometimes teachers make the students work on the assignments in class just to make sure that they can collect those assignments, because without that, there's no way actually for the teacher to know whether or not the students understood the course. For tasks, when done in groups, again, at the undergrad level, there is the problem of large size classes. When group work is done, it is effective in the sense that it changes the dynamics of the class. There's a little bit of interaction and engagement going on there, but it's challenging in terms of knowing who is working, who is not, who is doing what. It's challenging also to know who to pair with who, because the number of the students is quite is high, and one of the conditions for effective use of group work is to know who to pair with who. If a student with a low level is paired with a student with a low level, this wouldn't work. Sometimes it's not even a matter of level. Sometimes it could be a matter of personality traits. If a shy student is paired with a shy student, this wouldn't work as well. So there's a problem of pairing, the challenge of pairing students, mainly because of the large size of the classroom at the undergrad level. When tasks are done individually, very few students did actually the work. Oral tasks are better to some extent. It's usually about discussions or presentations, especially if error correction is not focused on and students are encouraged to talk. Mainly everything is led by the teacher. At the MA level, assignments are given on a weekly or even on a daily basis. For the tasks done in class, they're usually done in groups, and because again it's a small class size, they're better organized and better monitored. And the role of the teacher is more of a facilitator and a guide, and the rest is left for the students to actually lead and manage. For assessment at the BA level, there's the final exam. There are attempts, or there is the potential to use learning tasks for assessment, but because of low responsiveness to the tasks by the students, it's not easy again to know if the students understood the lesson, if everything was clear for them, etc. For the MA, it's continuous. The learning tasks are used for assessment purposes plus the final exam. What is common in both levels, though, is that the teacher's expectations are made clear in terms of assessment. For example, the students are given mock exams, so they would know what to expect in terms of the format and types of questions, and also to know what is expected from them to produce. And for that purpose, model answers are even sometimes they were observed to be given to students. Again, when it comes to assessment, more research is required because we need to know what the students are assessed on,
the criteria, who are the students involved in the process of assessment, how does assessment take place, does it go in alignment with the purposes of the course, etc., the impacts, etc. So there's a lot of work to do in assessment. We mentioned last time that there's a scarcity of research about assessment in general, and this is something that we really need to conduct research upon. So based on these findings, has the learning-centered approach worked? To some extent, yes, but it depends on the level of studies, BAMA, the class size, the students' needs, expectations, concerns. To what extent do we actually know our students? It depended also on the students' readiness for the course. Did they do their assigned readings? Did they do their practice exercises? Because these affect the level of motivation, the level of participation, and level of engagement in class. It also depended on the facilities and training, but not just training, again, according to the findings, because we found out that personal efforts and experience help a lot. There's a study in particular that I conducted on perceptions, or the professors' perceptions, teachers' perceptions of the need for pedagogical training. And two striking findings that came out is that training does not necessarily guarantee the use of effective teaching practices because of many factors. Students' reluctance to participate, for example, or readiness for the course, just to mention a few. And lack of training does not mean not using the learning-centered approach, which means that there's a lot of efforts done on the part of the teachers in terms of self-development. So can LLC be used? Yes, it is challenging and demanding, but not impossible to implement as far as I'm concerned. There are, however, a lot of things that we need to take into consideration. For example, the extent to which the context of learning and teaching is favorable, the extent to which it is conducive to good teaching and learning. Things we need to consider here is we have large mixed ability classes, which is an advantage, but a challenge in large classes. We need to take into consideration our students' interest in what is taught in their studies overall, whether the teaching aids and resources are provided, and the teacher-student relationship, the amount of dialogue, collaboration, respect, and care from both parts, the teacher and the student. There is a lot of a need for doing needs analyses to figure out our students' needs and expectations. There's need for training, continuous training, mainly in teacher development, because we need to keep up to date with everything that is going on. Everything is evolving right now, and we need to keep up to date with everything going on. Focus on the learning strategy. Students need to be made aware of the importance of learning about different learning strategies and how they can help them learn and how they can help them be independent in their learning. It's a way of making students, I think, aware of the fact that the teacher can be one of the resources they can resort to, but not the only source they can resort to. Through training and learning strategies, I think we would be able to work a little bit on the perceptions of teaching and learning, and make them more, change them, attempt to change them and make them a little bit more learner-centered. The curriculum needs to be varied in order to provide, again, for different learning styles and students' different levels, previous knowledge and experiences. There's need for assessment, for formative assessment, focus on assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. And there's need of consistency across teachers in the implementation of the learning-centered approach. Students feel at ease and comfortable with what they are used to the most, with what they feel comfortable with the most. And that would be the way they're used to be taught. So which is usually teacher-centered, if we go back into the
primary levels, secondary, etc. Of course, I'm not overgeneralizing, but if only a few teachers are using the learning-centered approach, and the rest are rather are not, we would create some kind of confusion amongst students. So we would not have the results we hope for, and we would not have the consistent results we hope for. We need to be on the same page and see eye to eye with our colleagues as well, and with our students. Yes, thank you. At the end.
Thank you much, Professor Karima, for this insightful, illuminating, original and logical presentation about this hot issue. I would say that you have put the stress on the most important aspects of this issue, and of course, what I enjoyed is the idea, of course, not only focusing on this approach, but also on the fact that it has achievements and limitations and challenges, and this is very much important to deal with. Now, may I, Abderrahim, may I give you the floor?
Yes.
May I give you the floor, or we go to questions? If somebody...
So I don't have a, clear point of this. I think, okay, Professor Slawi, what do you think? Yeah.
I think we give floor to the students and to the colleagues to ask questions. We will have a debate, and we will move on to the students. And of course, Professor, if you have any addition, any comments or whatever, you are
okay.
I would like to talk for 10 minutes after opening the debate, and the 4 questions that may be addressed to Professor Karima.
Mm-hmm.
Then I would like to talk just for 10 or 15 minutes, some addition.
Yes, it could be.
And thank you very much, Professor Karima, for, you have covered the most important variables and the most important defining issues of learner-centeredness and learning-centeredness. I would like to add to have a say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, because you have covered all the most important aspects of this timely approach to language teaching and learning in particular, and to education in general.
Thank you.
So, Sikir, you can give the floor to our colleagues to interact with Professor Karima and students, of course.
So you are invited, students and colleagues, to ask questions or to comment or to have some kind of observation on Professor Karima's presentation. Thank you. Yes? Yeah? Who's going to start?
Yes, Professor Sandy, if you don't mind.
Yes, go on.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor BELGHITI, for this informative presentation. I have a little question, and this question actually asked by Professor Wakrim in his book. So the question is, can the Moroccan students handle the responsibility so that this learning-centered approach can be demanded for them?
Should I answer now, or wait until all the questions are asked and then I answer?
As you like. It's better to go.
To answer now?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Luki, for your questions. Are they ready
right? This is your question.
Can they handle the responsibility?
Can they handle the responsibility? I think that it's a long process for them, and it's
Yes.
a long process for us.
Professor Karima, yeah, Professor Karima. Sorry for, do you hear me, please?
Yes.
Sorry for interruption. In addition to this question of Maki, here
Yeah.
I have an article published in Mate.
Yeah.
Published in Mate in Mate Proceedings in 1991. The title of this article by Ali Kaysari, General Inspector of English, Algeria. The title is learner-centeredness possible in the Maghrebi classroom? Just to enrich the question. Is it possible in the Maghrebi classroom? Yeah. Someone else hide, I think, yes. Yeah. M Hyde, Kotobe Church College, Kent, England. The title of the article, The Learner-Centered Approach, Its Appropriateness for the Moroccan Classroom. We can reformulate the title. Is it appropriate for the Moroccan classroom? It is an article also published in the same Mate Proceedings, 1991. Okay, so you can interact with it, just to say that this is an issue which is, debated, and we will to hear from our wonderful friend her own on this issue. Yes, thank you, and sorry for interruption.
No. At the beginning, of course, there was a lot of debate on the applicability of the learning-centered approach, and to what extent it is appropriate to the to our context, taking into consideration again that it's an approach that was designed or that started in a milieu that is different from ours. The profiles of the students are quite different. The facilities provided there are quite different. It's not what we have here. It's not the circumstances we have here. It's not the facilities that we have here. It's not even the profiles of the teacher and the students that we have here. So Professor Wakim said that are they ready? Are they ready to assume that responsibility? It's not a question for which there is a black or white answer. I think that to answer the question, we need to go back to what is done before, way before, starting from the primary classes. Were they involved in anything that would make them take the responsibility and be responsible for their own learning? It's a long process. Students, whatever they are used to, they would feel comfortable pursuing the path of what they are used to. So it's something that we need to start reflecting upon since the first stages of their schooling, not until they get to higher education or to the university level. So Maki, I think it's a long process, and it's a long process that should start way early. Not in a stage in which they have already a full-fledged picture or a complete picture for them of what learning should be, of what teaching should be like. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Karima. Somebody else, please.
Yes, Kibir.
أخويا.
Yes, if you don't mind, Professor Karima, can I join you?
Sure.
And react to the question of C. Maki?
Yeah.
C. Maki, Professor Mohamed Wakrin himself answered the question in 1988 in his article entitled "The Neglected Spaces Need Some Air."
Yeah.
Professor Mohamed Wakrin argued at the time that yes, learner-centeredness is possible, appropriate in the Moroccan context, and that it works and all is needed is to create, to focus on the learner and to give him or her the necessary air, that is autonomy, independence, and responsibility.
Mhm.
And maybe I didn't talk to Professor Wakrim about this. Maybe Professor Mohamed Wakrim knew that some practitioners or scholars would or might question the applicability and appropriateness of learner-centeredness in in Eastern countries for cultural and institutional reasons. He predicted this kind of question, and he answered this question 4 years, yes, 3 years before his participation in May 1991, and a number of articles were entitled in the form and format of questions, whether it is possible or not. Yes, it is possible. He answered this question. And of course, there is always a gap between theory and the principles, including those define learner-centeredness itself and practice. In different contexts, there is always a gap. How wide it is, how deep it is, it differs from one context to another, and it depends on how we define the context. It doesn't mean the Moroccan context or the French context, maybe the context from one classroom to another, maybe from one group, from one time of the day to another. Thank you very much, Miki, and thank you very much, Professor Karima, for your clarification.
I would like to add something again with this, with respect to this. We need to understand that any innovation in pedagogy, anything that is new in pedagogy needs time. It needs time. And and it needs to be paved for. It needs to be paved for. And that's the problem with the past reforms. We have been adopting more than adapting. So it's not a question of is it the context, the Maghrebi context or not. It is applicable. We just need to pave the road for it to be implemented and used in an effective way. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Karima, Professor Elkarfa, for these additions, interesting additions. Somebody else, please. Another question, comment, observation?
Yes, Professor?
Yeah, go on, Iman.
Okay. So first, it is a great pleasure to take part in this webinar series. Thank you very much, Professor Elkarfa. Thank you, dear professors, Professor Sandy, Professor Slawi, Professor Nadir, Professor Jamil. It's a very great pleasure to meet you again. Thank you, dear Professor BELGHITI, for the very informative presentation. You've actually answered all the implications and clarified all the implications I had about learner-centered approach, but I still have only one question, which is, apart from grades, what can help the teachers know that students are progressing in their learning? Thank you very much.
Apart from what?
Grades. She says grades.
Apart from grades.
Grades?
Yes.
Well, that's what learning-centered approach is all about. We should not simply focus on grades just to know whether or not our students are. Sorry, I muted myself.
Okay.
We should not focus simply on grades to know whether or not our students are making any progress. That would be too late, actually. So the whole concept of the learning-centered approach is to opt for continuous assessment and formative assessment. We need to be assessing our students throughout the whole course and throughout the whole semester, not only with exams and quizzes, but with the activities and the tasks we involve them in.
So that's what's going to tell us whether the students are actually understand what we are teaching them, to the extent to which they grasp to what we are teaching them, the extent to which they can perform what we are teaching them. Basing everything or waiting just for the grade, that's not the gist of the learning centeredness to begin with. Assessment starts from the beginning of the class, if you would like to. It's not at the end of the class. So it's a continuous. It should be continuous. It should be formative. This is what I talked about last time. There should be assessment for learning, assessment that would help us know how our students learn and whether or not they are learning, and how we can adapt what we are teaching them so that they would learn even better throughout the whole semester. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sikibir, please.
Yes, Professor Slawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sikibir.
Okay.
Dear Karima, thank you very much for this inspiring and very, very pertinent presentation. As Professor KARFA said, you covered almost every aspect of the topic. Thank you very much for all the efforts you invested in this presentation. So I join my students, Iman, and probably ask the question from a teacher's perspective rather than from a student's perspective. I would say, how can we evaluate, how can we assess that this learner-centered approach is effectively effective? Okay, how can we evaluate this approach and say, yes, this is a good and this is the best approach to adopt in our teaching career as teachers? For example, I give you a simple example. Sometimes when you give the students at the MA program, I give you concrete examples. When you give the students readings, you give them resources to review, to present, etc. But when they give the presentation, you feel that the students are feeling frustrated. They say probably the teachers are lazy, they don't want to give lectures, they don't want to share knowledge, and they are assuming us responsibility. Indeed, we are actually contributing in making them independent researchers, independent scholars, especially at the level of the master program. But sometimes you have these perceptions and attitudes of students towards the teaching process. Okay, I hope I have been clear, Karima, in my points. And
Yeah.
This is just a remark, and I would like to have your reaction if possible. Thank you very much, dear friend.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yeah.
Sikibir.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah.
Sikibir, how are you?
Yeah.
Can
Good.
we,
Okay, Professor Madani with you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Professor. Yeah. Okay. Professor. I think Professor Karima would like to say something now.
Okay.
I can answer Professor Samuel or wait for Professor Madani.
Yeah, you answer. I think.
I think you will join both questions because they are related.
Yeah.
You know, to save time. Thank you, Professor Karima. It's really, thank you for sharing with us your thoughts and ideas about learner-centered approach. I think, and it's really wonderful, informative, and I think in this approach of learner-centeredness, is something that is easy and difficult at the same time. Easy because it's a little bit personalized. It is engaging. It's the competency based and not restricted only to the classroom. This is a situation where students, of course, take great responsibility for their learning and support each other's progress. So I think here that in this case, we can say that every student should get the skills he or she needs to succeed and contribute to the society. Nonetheless, I think if, for example, students cannot assume their responsibility 100%, then they will be this will have a bad negative consequences on his learning. And sometimes we people say that we would blame the teacher because the teacher in learner-centered approach has got a secondary role. For me, I think the role of the teacher should always be prioritized in the sense that he should monitor, should, I think, guide, gear the students' learning process to the attainment of its objective. So I think I just want to make this small comparison between the way we have been, I would say, learning and today's approach. So we used to read a lot of books in our time, and we used to I would say to summarize them and do a lot of important works. But nowadays you give everything to the students, but still we feel, I'm not generalizing by the way, but I think there are a lot of cases where you give assignments, then sometimes with the internet now, students are find themselves just obliged to read summaries or just to look for the easiest way, and this is a big problem. So how would you react to that? Thank you very much, Professor Karima.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Madani. Yes, Karima.
Yes. So
can I speak, please? Yes.
Yeah, I think there was a question by Professor Slawi before.
Yeah. So Professor Slawi said, how can we say that it's working? How can we say that it's the best approach? Should we even talk about something like the best approach? Is there a best approach out there? I don't think so that there's a best approach out there, but there are effective teaching practices and there are effective learning practices. And even these might be relative. What might work for me might not work for somebody else in terms of teaching and in terms of learning. So how would you know if it is working? There are ways of how you can do so. For example, in class, through the learning tasks, you would know if it's working through the extent the students are responsive to it, through the extent to which the students are engaged, through the level of performance of the students in those tasks. But even that might depend again on different other factors. That's why we talk about the necessity of having a good, favorable teaching and learning environment to begin with. There's needs for a lot of collaboration on both parts, the teacher and the student. There's need for a good teacher-student relationship. And there's need for, again, needs analyses. I think the more we make what we teach responsive to what they need, like, and want to learn, the more we would be able to make our teaching effective and the learning effective as well. To react to Professor Madani's comment, which is the students' tendency to opt for the easy way out. Do they have a choice sometimes? Or do they know how to do it differently? That's the question I think we should ask ourselves. Do they know how to do it differently? Because I think that if they had other options, they would opt for them. And this is again bringing us back to learning strategies. Do they know how to learn? Probably throughout their whole schooling life, or up till they come to the university, they've been used to rote memorization or rote learning. So when they come to a context that challenges them in a way, or makes the pressure on them to reflect, to infer, to discuss, etc., they don't know how to do that. So that would be why they would opt for the easy way out. So I think we need to focus on making them aware that there are other ways for them to learn, other ways through which they can make their learning better. If I teach, for example, my student that he or she can correct his own mistake, I'm giving him or I'm teaching him or her a learning strategy, which is self-correction. And I'm making him independent, relatively speaking, independent when it comes to correcting some of his mistakes. If I'm teaching him or her that instead of learning a list of vocabulary by heart, that he needs to or she needs to understand or she needs to train, they need to train themselves to figure out the meaning out of the context and to use that word in a context. That's another learning, that's another alternative that I'm giving the student instead of the easy way out. So I think we need to focus on do they know what to do? Do they know how to learn? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Karima. Somebody else, please. Another question.
Can I speak, please?
Yes, Professor.
Hello. Yes, hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Karima BELGHITI, for this interesting presentation, which, of course, has clarified many points regarding this approach, learner-centered approach. My thanks, or I extend my thanks to Professor Abderrahim Elkarfa. It's really a great opportunity that to gather all these colleagues and brilliant students and to speak about different aspects related to language teaching and learning. So I will just join Professor Suad Slawi when she said that she speaks about teachers' laziness. That is to say, students think while teachers adopt this learner-centered approach, think that teacher is a lazy teacher because most of the time he's just assigning activities to students. And it is something that happened to me. I was teaching public speaking, and as you know, public speaking is something I assigned only activities during the whole class, because public speaking is speaking in public, is how to confront the audience, is how to avoid the communication apprehension. And finally, I heard that most of my students say that Professor Kinzasedani is just assigning activities, is not doing an effort with her students.
Yeah.
What I would like to say here is that I think that it's the mentality of the students who need to change, because I think and I feel that the student is very happy, or the student feels that he's really learning something when the teacher is giving the lecture.
Everything. Yeah.
Teacher, yes, when the teacher is really trying to give the whole knowledge, yes, to his students, but when implementing those new characteristics of a learner centered approach, like for instance getting students to think about thinking, like for instance giving them a problem solving skills, or encouraging collaboration between, of course, classmates, I think that they're not, you feel that they're not very happy, very excited.
Yes.
And I think that of course we say that we are in the 21st century, we're living in a technological world, in a globalized world, but at the same time the mentality is the mentality. So it needs to be changed, and I think it's up not only to the teacher but also to the students to do some efforts, right? To know exactly how he can, because it's great to say that we need independent students, autonomous students, responsible students, but how can we produce those students? How can we make them independent and autonomous and responsible if they keep this mentality of deliver the whole information and to deliver the whole knowledge? And thank you very much.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. We need to work on the students' mindsets. They've been used to probably a teacher who does it all. So when they are in a context, as I explained earlier, in which the teacher is trying to give them some responsibility, trying to make them autonomous, trying to make them problem solve, reflect, etc., sometimes they might even resist
what's going on. Hello?
Yes, please.
So I guess even they might even resist the type.
I think there is a problem.
That type of teacher who's trying them to do, for them, he's trying to make them do the whole work, and for them he's a lazy teacher, because they're used to, again, to somebody who's lecturing, giving them all the information, all the knowledge they need to know. That's why, again, we need to work on our students' learning strategies, because they teach them that throughout the process, they would eventually make them aware that the teacher is only one of the sources that they can resort to, and not the only source that they can resort to, that they can rely on themselves and many of the things they do in order to learn. And that's why, again, consistency amongst the teachers and the way they teach is very important. If just a few are practicing the learner-centered approach, and the rest are not, this is what I mentioned by the end of my presentation as confusion, and the students would more likely opt for the profile of the teachers they feel comfortable the most with in terms of their way of teaching. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Karima.
Thank you, Professor Karima. Thank you.
Yes, somebody else, please.
Sikibir, please. There are some questions on the conversation group. You can please look at them and address them to Professor Karima. I think there are two questions, one by Bin Dawood Nadif, and another one by, it's a pertinent question by Dawood, and also we have Abderrahim Khomish. Yes, two questions, very pertinent questions.
Sandy?
Yes, I'm so sorry, Professor Sandy.
Hello, Professor Sandy. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yeah,
hello,
yes.
Sandy?
Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I hope you're doing well. First, I would like to thank Professor BELGHITI for her insightful presentation. I would like to thank the organizer, Mr. KARFA.
The volume is too low.
To thank the moderator, Mr. Professor Kennedy. It's my pleasure to be with you on this live, in this Zoom session. Well,
Thank you.
Learner-centered approach, in fact, stems from the humanist approach, and it has the aim of putting learners at the heart of the teaching and learning operation. Of course, there are a lot of challenges in the application of this approach in the Moroccan context. This is a matter of upbringing and cultural constraints that do not encourage children and students to nurture responsibility and independence from an early age, or at an early age. This would probably lead us to say that it is a long process, that it requires a lot of effort on the part of families, teachers, and learners themselves. And regarding what Professor Wakrim referred to as neglected species, because we need some air, that metaphorically speaking, air, autonomy, independence, and responsibility. Well, I would reverse the air, because we should start with responsibility, teaching learners to become responsible first, then independent, then move on to autonomy. because the focus on the learners should be nurtured from the beginning, on the early stages, in the family environment.
Yeah.
Starting from very small activities, problem solved, project-based learning, PBL, task-based approaches, and all these ways and these activities can be conducive to learner-centered approach. In fact, referring to as the best approach, as you mentioned, Professor BELGHITI and Professor KARFA, I totally agree that there is no best approach. Now, a lot of scholars and a lot of, practitioners are going beyond the method. They say post-methodism, and this means that there is no perfect method, and that all methods are work in complementarity, and each one can serve in a particular situation and according to the objectives that are meant, and also the sort of activities, the age factor of the learners, and a lot of other parameters. Now, this focus on the learner should not also lead us to forget the central element, who is the teacher. And I think there is much tendency on focusing on the learner, and on the other hand, forgetting about the teacher, who is the main agent also, because both teachers and learners, and as well as the materials, are important. We should not also neglect the role of professional development in leading teachers to follow up and being updated with what's going on in the educational field, and link it to all other spectrums. That's all I have to say. I have no question. Thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very much.
really learned very much from your webinars. Keep it up, and best regards to everyone.
Thank you very much, Natif. Yeah.
Welcome.
Professor Karima, I have a question.
Sure.
From Abderrahim, who says, how would a teacher force a learn-centered approach when culture itself is not fostering the value of responsibility, independence, and self-regulation and self-regulated learning? Fostering.
No, force.
How would a teacher force learner-centered approach when culture itself is not fostering the values of responsibility, independence, and regulated learning? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we force anything? I don't think that we should force anything. We're trying. We try, and we try our best. I think his question has to do a little bit with what Professor Natif just shared with us, the role of the culture in the family, the way we are socialized sometimes is sometimes consolidated and solidified in the school context. If we don't teach our kids responsibility at home, so how would we expect them to be responsible in school? If we don't teach them how to express their minds at home, how do we expect them to express their minds or even participate in school? So I think it's something for us to think about, the role of the family, the way we educate, or the whole process of upbringing, and how it transcends to the school context. But at the same time, I think we're all here, the fruit of the Moroccan public school. What I want to say is, students, when they are given the chance,
they can amaze you when they are given the opportunity. They can amaze you, of course, with specific conditions in a specific context. And I would just share an experience based on a study that I conducted on critical thinking among a group of pupils and adults, starting from the age of 10 until the age of 18 years old. We have this tendency to say that the culture does not foster critical thinking. Again, it does not give much room for pupils or for adults or whoever to express themselves, to be critical, etc. But what we saw in those classes amazed us when those pupils were given the opportunity, again using the appropriate teaching practices. They could manifest critical thinking. They could manifest critical thinking to a large extent. So sometimes it's about, again, giving them the chance, and giving them the chance with the right tools in the right or in the appropriate context. Yeah.
So if I just... Professor Kabir, Sandy, can I make a question?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Please, thank you very much. This is Professor Yusuf Tamer from Agadir, Faculty of Letters, Department of English. I would like, first of all, to thank Professor KARFA for inviting me to attend with you these interesting lectures. It's very illuminating, and I like very much the synergy going on among you. To be quick and short, I just would like also to thank Professor BELGHITI for the nice presentation. To be realistic, coming back to the ground, as we know, we are professors on the ground, so we know the situation a little bit due to the large classes that we have, either high school or middle school or primary school, up to higher education. Now, the question is, how could we foster, not force, but how could we foster and improve this learner-centered approach among our students when we have so many students? I just want to raise this question because this is what we're going to see in the ground. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Professor BELGHITI.
Large classrooms are very challenging to handle, and I mentioned that in the presentation. They're not easy to handle in terms of the needs. To begin with, how are you going to cater for the needs of and expectations of all those students? And they're not easy to handle if you would like to organize group work, because again, learning-centeredness focuses on a lot of collaborative work, on a lot of teamwork, etc. So there are challenging in terms of group work. They are challenging in terms of continuous assessment and formative assessment if we can do it. But again, this, to me, it should not discourage us from at least trying. I said at the beginning, it's a long process. It's a long process, and we need to give it time. We need to give it time, and we need to try. We need to at least try. It shouldn't be an excuse for us just to back up and not do anything and just resort to lecturing and the students taking notes and that's it. We should at least trying group work. It's going to be noisy. There's going to be a lot of chaos, but at least you would be engaging students and making them interact. Try to do needs analyses, if not in a formal way, at least in an informal way. I've observed teachers who, after, for example, giving the course description to their students, they would ask them questions, simple questions like, is there anything that you would like to learn in this course that is not covered in the course description? Is there anything that you are expecting or you are expecting to learn from this course that is not there? There are ways for us to always try.
and we need to keep in mind that we are working in specific circumstances. We need to do our best with respect to the circumstances that we are in and hope for the best. Thank you.
Yes, somebody else, please.
Yes, sir.
Hello, everyone.
Yes, sir.
Ask a question.
Yes, Abderrahim.
All right, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for to my great teachers, Professor Sandy and also Professor Slawi and also Professor Abderrahim for inviting me to this webinar. And I will extend my thanks also to my professor, Karima BELGHITI, for informative and really insightful presentation. So I will try to cut it very short, all right? So I think it goes without saying that the LLC is difficult to implement and to apply, all right? And some reasons or the rationale behind this difficulty are manifold, and some of them are low infrastructure or poor infrastructure of the school, sometimes lack of training, sometimes we find a lot of things. But don't you think that some or the reason or another reason for this is the lack and the gap, the lack of mutual understanding and interaction, and the gap between philosophers, researchers, whose responsibility is to engineer and to come up with these great theories, okay, like Jack C. Richards and others, with practitioners and teachers in the classroom, right? But sometimes we find that the latter, the teachers, they are complaining that those who are in the ivory tower, those who are theorizing, they don't consult them, they don't come up or come down and discuss with them, or have a round table with them, right? Integrating their views, okay? And sometimes we find like these philosophers, educational philosophers, they say, for example, teachers are very adamant. They say things are not very they can't work in this environment. They are very pessimistic, okay? But don't you think that the gap between the educational philosophers and the researchers and also practitioners is another reason for the difficulty of implementing this approach? And thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Professor BELGHITI, please.
I would say that there's rather a gap between the reforms and the classroom practices. The people who work on the reforms, there is a gap between them and between what is going on in our classrooms. So the reality of things, the reality of how things are, the reality of how things are done, the reality of how our students actually learn or manage to learn. Reforms are usually, I don't know, over ambitious in a way. And again, I talked about this at the beginning during the discussion we had earlier with Professor Elkarfa. We are adopting, we are not adapting. We need to take into consideration our context with the facilities that we have in our context, the profiles of the teacher and the students that we have in our context, and the circumstances that we have in our context before we can talk about any reforms and how we can make things better. We need to see first what we have and what we can work for and what we can work with, so that we can at least make sure that whatever we will be bringing in new to the mix would work. And we should not expect it to work right away. I said earlier again that any innovation needs time. And according to Numa Marquis, who's an expert in task-based learning and teaching, it needs at least 10 years. Now, if you pay attention to the interval between every reform in Morocco, there are no 10 years between each reform and the others. So we need to give it time. enough time to see what worked, what didn't work, and then proceed from there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Hello, can I speak?
Yes, please. Nora.
Yes. Hello, dear Professor Sandy and
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I miss you all, Professor Sandy, Professor Elkarfa, and Professor Slawi. Well, thank you very much, Professor BELGHITI, for your eye-opening presentation. I have a question, and I will base it on 2 points mentioned during this discussion. The first is the idea that learning-centered approach needs time to be implemented. And then the second idea is what Professor Slawi has referred to is the perceptions that learners have about what learning-centered approach is, which means that when the teacher tries to give some floor or some freedom to the students to decide for their own learning, to give presentation, to do their own reading, they usually students perceive that as a reluctance from the parts of the teachers, a laziness from their parts. So my idea is, don't you think that such perceptions are due to the fact that university and professors perceive or receive students after they have a learning experience of 12 years? And I'm here referring to the primary school, the middle school, and the high school. Don't you think that this learning experience with this long period is enough to construct a learning habit, I will call them habits, or to construct perceptions that may be difficult to change at the university level? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's what we have been talking about. Those perceptions of learning and those perceptions of teaching. That it's an accumulation of years of being exposed to a particular type of teaching in particular, and getting used to a particular way of learning. So, is this easy to overcome? No, I'm not saying that it's easy to overcome, but we need to try. We need to try. I know that there are courses at the department like study skills, and way before study skills there was I think méthodologie de travail universitaire, and these are courses whose aim is to actually prepare the students for this transition between high school, middle school, primary school, and the university level. Now, to what extent, again, these have been effective, that's something for research to reveal. But I guess that we need to think about the ways through which we can work on the transferability of skills. Learning strategies, for example, should not only be focused on study skills, on the study skills course, they need to be focused on in other courses, so that the students would see that, oh, this is not the only course in which I'm being taught this. It is taught in this course as well, and in this course as well. So the transferability of the skills that we teach our students should be focused on at the level of the university, and we should try. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Leiti. There is Professor Amqran who would like to say something, please. Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, Professor Amqran.
Hello.
Yeah, yes. Yes, please.
Yes. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Abderrahim Elkarfa, for inviting me for the first time. Professor Sandy, thank you as well, and special thanks go to Professor Slawi and Professor BELGHITI for her insightful lecture. First of all, I would like to invoke a famous statement which I keep repeating on many occasions, which is it's by Francis Mackay, who says that a method is one thing, its application So the challenging step or the challenging side is the implementation or the application of a specific method. To the extent that it's quite arguable that all the methods, the learning methods or the teaching methods that the history of education has known up to now might be argued, which means the challenges and the problems arise from the context in which a teaching method is applied. And this takes me to make some kind of remark about a question which was raised before, which is about the approach suitability of the learner-centered classroom, especially the Moroccan classroom of in public institutions. And I would like here to invert the question and say that it's plausible, more plausible and more practical to make the question, formulate the question as follows. To what extent is the Moroccan context of the class, the Moroccan classroom is suitable and appropriate to the application of the learner-centered method, any other approach? And thank you very much once again for giving us these golden opportunities. In fact, you turned the confinement, hard moments of confinement into a series of feasts and conviviality. Thank you very much.
An enjoyable experience. Yes, I agree.
Yes.
Yes, please, Karima.
Yes, I agree. I agree with him. To what extent is it suitable for the Moroccan context? It is applicable to me. It is applicable. There are challenges. There are things that we need to take into consideration, and it is actually the question that needs to be asked every time there is a new reform coming in. To what extent is the road paved for that reform to be implemented with everything that it's bringing in new to our context? Yes, I do agree with you, Professor Amkran. Yeah.
Yes, please, somebody else, please.
Let's see. See Kibir.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, see Kibir.
Yeah.
I think we will open discussion again. Some of our colleagues and students, they may have some questions, so they can articulate formulate questions to the end of the this seminar, to let one of her friends have a rest, her breath, and questions may repeat themselves. It's okay, and to save time for those who may need to prepare dinner or
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Kibir. I think we have two students presenters, and I would like to contribute to have a say.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. And then we listen to our students, or we listen to our students.
Yeah, we will listen to our students. Yeah.
Then I will try to talk for 10 minutes.
Okay.
Iman, are your friends reading?
Iman? Yes, Professor. Yes, they're here.
Are your friends ready? Are you today?
Yes. So that we have two presenters, Insaf Khudri and Ilham Al-Hazzi.
So they are welcoming you.
Insaf?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Insaf?
Yes, sir. I'm here. How are you doing?
Yes, you are there. And who else, your friend? I'm fine, and you?
I'm okay, thank you.
Your friend is?
Ilham.
Second presenter?
Ilham.
Ilham, okay, so Insaf. Okay, Insaf, the floor is yours.
Okay, so first of all, I want to express my gratitude to you, Professor Elkarfa, for the hard work and the efforts you put into the course. I deeply thank Professor BELGHITI Karima for her assistance and the time she dedicates once again to the 10th seminar in the masterclass webinar series. So without delay, I will share the screen.
Insaf, you still here?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I think it is not working, so I'm going to deliver the presentation without sharing the screen.
No problem.
So,
go ahead.
Okay. So today's presentation is about learner-centered teaching or learner-centered approach. So in order to deliver this presentation, we're going to follow this outline: introduction, a general one, a definition of learner-centered approach, 10 elements of student-centered learning, the roots of student-centered learning. This is for my part. The 5 practice areas of learner-centered approach, the role of ICT in learner-centered teaching, and a general conclusion will be delivered by Ilham. Learner-centered teaching is an approach to teaching that is increasingly encouraged in education. Learner-centered approach did not rely on one single method, but this approach emphasizes a variety of different types of methods that shift the role of teachers from givers of information to facilitators in student learning. Traditionally, teachers focused on what they do and not on what learners learn or students learn. And this emphasis on what students or what teachers do often lead to students who are passive and did not take responsibility for their own learning. Educators call this approach teacher-centered approach. In contrast, learner-centered approach occurs when teachers focus on student learning. And we have some definitions of student-centered learning. The first one is Brown 2001, stated that learner-centered teaching includes techniques that focus on or account for learners' needs, styles, and goals. Techniques that give some control to the students. Students have some control or gain some control over their own learning. They could decide the time for their for their activities or the time to do a task, etc. A curricula that include the consultation and input of students and that do not presuppose objectives in advance. So the curricula in general includes lessons, includes the content that is taught by a teacher, and with the consultation of students' input, teachers could have access to, I would say, could have access to the recent profile or the recent and updated profiles of what being a student is. The fourth one is techniques that allow for students' creativity and innovation. Also, techniques that enhance the student's sense of competence and self-worth. The second one is Felder and Brent, 1996, defined student-centered learning. I'm sorry. Student-centered learning as a broad teaching approach that includes substituting first active learning for lectures, holding students responsible for their learning, and using self-paced or cooperative team-based learning. So here we have 4 keywords: active learning, responsibility for learning, self-paced, cooperative learning. Many elements have been proposed for student-centered learning. And here we have a table by Jacobs et al. Discuss 10 elements of student-centered learning. The first one is students and teachers as co-learners. Teachers gladly acknowledge that they do not know everything, and teachers learn along with students. So inspirations for teachers and students as co-learners comes from Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher who supposedly said, to know is to know that you know nothing. This is the meaning of true knowledge. In fact, teachers or language teachers have a great deal to learn from and with students. Many ways exist, such as sharing electronic resources, etc. Or simply a teacher can say to students, I'd like to know more about it, or would any one of you like to investigate it with me afterwards? We can share what we have learned with the rest of the classroom, etc. The second one is student-to-student interaction. Teachers encourage students to share with their peers in both face-to-face and online contexts. When students interact with peers, they become the active ones, while teachers talk much less, acting instead as more, let's say, facilitators in student interaction, and they can intervene to question, to correct, to motivate, to share, or to praise, like saying, I like it, I like the way you did something, for example. The third one is learner autonomy. So as discussed before, that learner or student interaction enables students to become more self-independent from their teachers, as students form support networks with peers. These support networks prepare students to be autonomous. Yes, as Benson, I guess, Benson 2013 defined a capacity to control important aspects of one's learning. And control is a key concept here. However, some students lack the skill to wisely exercise control over their own learning. So it would be better, and also prefer to avoid the responsibility that accompanies learners' autonomy. So it would be best in this case to introduce autonomy in a gradual manner. For example, students can be given the choices in areas to what extent, to what extensive listening or extensive reading materials to use, what post-listening or post-reading activities to do, or simply the teacher can give students the freedom to name their group. These are some simple questions. We have also focused on meaning. The best learning takes place when students fully understand what they are studying and why they are studying it. So students most of the time lack the big picture of what they are studying. So the what is the content, but the why is why do we need to study? It is in order to communicate, in order to solve real life problems that we will encounter in the future. And the focus on meaning is the opposite of focus on forms, which was used in the past by the traditional methods, which emphasizes or focus on teaching students discrete units of the language. We have curricular integration. Students understand the links between, on one hand, what they study in school, and on the other hand, the life beyond the classroom. So here we're talking about progressivism, and we're going to discuss this in the roots. Diversity learners cater to students' differences and help students appreciate the benefits of diversity. And when we talk about diversity, we talk about a teacher coming into the classroom coming to the classroom in which there are students with different needs, styles, goals, multiple intelligences. So the role of teacher is to cater to students' differences in order to improve or help improve their learning. Thinking skills, students go beyond the information given to them as they apply, give examples, disagree, make new connections, teach each other, and discover. So they do most of the work. Alternative assessment broadens to include non-traditional forms, and students join teachers as assessors. So now we are talking about self-assessment, peer assessment, and even teachers give students or negotiate with students in what way they want to be assessed, if not in what areas they want to be assessed on. Motivate, let's say, learning climate. Students and teachers strive toward an atmosphere conducive to robust participation by all class members. So when we talk about learning climate, we talk about an environment, we talk about a learner and the teacher working, both of them, in order to create an environment which is conducive to learning, which is anxiety-free, which enables students to be more fluent and express themselves freely. Motivation, intrinsic motivation, becomes predominant as classroom climate harmonizes with students' innate desire to learn. So with student-centered learning, we talk about intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. The last point in my presentation, in my part, sorry, are the roots of student-centered learning. The first one is progressive education. And when we talk about the progressive education, there is one man who can, or figure who can left out, or who is John Dewey, who is a champion of progressivism, which emphasizes learning by doing, interacting with the world in which students live in the current days, cooperating with classmates and people or others beyond the classroom, using learning in order to improve the life of others. The second one is the humanistic psychology. And in order to understand the humanistic psychology, we have to compare it to the behavioristic psychology. In particular, there are three main characteristics. The first one is the emphasis on behaviors rather than thoughts and feelings underlying these behaviors. The second one is the view that the law of, I would say, the law of learning is generalizable across species and regardless of context. The third one is extrinsic motivation. So humanistic psychologists such as Rogers have a different view, one which emphasizes not just cognition, but also affect, such as attitude, self-esteem, motivation, which looks for what is unique in each individual and in each situation, and also strives for intrinsic motivation. The third one is constructive theory, and here we're talking about Piaget, who maintains that I would say that learners construct their own learning by themselves, and that the process or the process of knowledge construction is an active one in which students take the information from teachers, from the course book, or teaching, course book, I'm sorry, the course book and the internet and other sources, and make it their own. Through what? Through explaining, through debating, role playing, through comparing, through connecting, etc. So the last point is the last root is the sociocultural theory, and here we're talking about Vygotsky. And when we talk about, there is here one keyword, which is scaffolding, meaning that students learn inside a group in which there is a teacher, there are peers and others, and those kind of people will help support, let's say, that student in order to improve. And thank you very much. Here are some of the, I'm sorry, I have some references. I won't be able to share them with you. Now it is the turn of Ilham. She can, the floor is her. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ilham. Ilham. Ilham.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, the floor is yours. Hello.
Yes, Ilham, where are you?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, of course. It's clear. Go on.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
So good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing great. I would like to thank you, Professor Slawi, Professor Elkarfa, Professor Sandy, and Professor BELGHITI for your outstanding and grateful presentation. Thank you all without distinction.
You are welcome.
So the second part of this presentation is going to be about first the 5 practice areas that teachers need to work on in order to achieve learner-centered teaching. And the second one is going to be about the role of ICT in learner-centered teaching. So let me first start by the 5 practice areas that teachers need to work on in order to achieve learner-centered teaching. Firstly, I would say that learner-centered teaching methods shifts the focus of activity from the teacher to the learner. These shifts gives a rise to change from the roles of instructors as well as students. And I will elaborate more on this point later on. In the same way, teachers need to adopt this new approach in their teaching process. So in order to implement LCT, I mean learner-centered teaching effectively as well as successfully, Weimer in 2002 suggests 5 practice areas that teachers need to work on in order to achieve learner-centered teaching. So what are these 5 practice areas? We have first the balance of power. Weimer begins with a couple of questions concerning this issue, which are: would we characterize our students as empowered, self-confident, self-motivated learners? Who decides what students learn in the course? Who set the conditions for learning, things like attendance policies and assignment deadlines? Who controls and regulates the flow of communication, deciding who gets the opportunity to speak, when, and for how long? So while answering to these questions, Weimer concludes that most of the important decisions about learning for students are made by teachers alone, in the sense that students don't involve in that. And this makes most of students indeed less self-confident as well as less motivated. And for this reason, according to Weimer, for sure, teachers need to rethink in their over authority, which might hinder students from developing their learning skills. So sharing power becomes crucial through many ways. For instance, concerning the course content, instructors could offer a list of possible topics from which they could pick those that they are interested in, and they could also let them decide the content of the review session. The second element that teachers need to work on in order to achieve learner-centered teaching effectively is the role of teacher. So the balance of power that I have just talked about brings about a teacher, brings up the role, that the balance of power that I have just talked about brings about a change in the role of teacher. So the new role of teacher is mainly to facilitate or facilitating the learning processes through designing different kind of activities that engage students with different styles of learning. And finally, to encourage students to access knowledge from many resources, since teachers no longer considered as the only source of knowledge. So here we move from an authoritative teacher to facilitator one. The third element that teachers need to work on is the function of content. Teacher-centered approach indeed focuses a lot on the quantity, or in other words, the amount of content that students need to cover. According to this approach, the more is better. Thus, Weimer calls for rethinking in the function of content, while for learner-centered teaching, the main interest is to develop learning skills and learning self-awareness or learner self-awareness. Because what is significant is what students will be able to do with the content in the real lifetime, not how much it did take. It's not about quantity, it's about developing learning skills and learner self-awareness. And I will add another element is lifelong learning. Another element that teachers need to work on is the responsibility of learning. So, teacher-centered approach creates indeed dependent learners who feel insecure once having to take responsibility over their learning process. So in order to convey students to take charge of their learning, instructors should build appropriate class climates that enhance student responsibility, autonomy, and lifelong learning. through many ways, such as listening to them carefully. I mean, listening to your students carefully without underestimating their strengths, to show them that what they are seeing, what they are doing is good, and to show them that they are clever enough, and putting them in the context of information to think deeply instead of just memorizing. Because we would like to produce critical thinkers, students who thinks deeply in things, not just to memorize, and to be responsible for their learning. The last element that indeed teachers need to work on in attempt to achieve learner-centered teaching is evaluation. So for teaching-centered approach, the evaluation purpose is to generate grades through using mainly two evaluation techniques, which could be sometimes written tests, sometimes reading tests, and sometimes both of them. It depends on teacher and his concerns. And students might find this stressful, I mean, causing them feeling of anxiety and sometimes fear. So, Weimer's new rule of evaluation indeed does not break altogether with traditional rule of, does not break altogether with the traditional rule, because testing for her is still crucial. But for learner-centered teaching, the assessment purpose is mainly to promote learning. Is mainly, I said, to promote learning. What students learn, how they learn, and the extent to which they learn, in a bid to make students able to evaluate their performance and competence by themselves. And this is what is called self-evaluation. And this will help them also not just to evaluate themselves, I mean, their performance and competence, but also the performance and competence of their teachers and their classmates sometimes. So, because when teachers or instructors put students in the heart of evaluation, he or she gives them more opportunities of learning. So in learning-centered teaching, there is a diversity of evaluation techniques. For example, a teacher can depend on presentations, can depend on class discussion, can depend on oral examination, not just the written tests and the written tests, which makes students most of the time anxious and fear and so on and so forth. So I have another element concerning this issue, online assessment. In online assessment, there is a diversity of tests. We have shuffle questions, we have multiple choice questions, we have open questions, we have short questions, and so on and so forth. So e-evaluation tools can be done on Moodle, on Zoom, and many websites. So in this area, I would say that teachers need to work a lot on this in order to diversify all the types of tests. I mean, not just to depend on written and reading tests. We have a lot of techniques, as I said, presentations, that will help students that will engage students in teaching and learning process, not just to be passive one. So now I will move to the second part of this presentation. Is going to be about the role of ICT in learner-centered teaching. What are these rules? First, we have personalized learning. Indeed, technology allows for unprecedented level of personalized learning through many ways, such as it facilitates the access of knowledge in very short period of time at any place, and this gives learners indeed more opportunities to study individually and to access different kinds of knowledge, as long as teachers no longer consider it as the only source of knowledge. We have also the balance of power. I mean that ICT contributes effectively in learner-centered teaching. So the balance of power. In this regard, I would say that technology also contributes in the balance of power. To word this differently, the implementation of technology as well as pedagogy empowers both teachers and students to make decisions about their teaching and learning process. It contributes in that balance and equality inside the classroom. So those two rules, I mean personalized learning and the balance of power, emphasize the importance of ICT. And for this reason, I would say that when evaluating how student-centered learning is incorporated or implemented into school or district, it is critical to assess the extent to which, I mean that when we'd like to study or to assess to what extent learner-centered teaching or student-centered learning implement in teaching and learning process effectively as well as successfully, we need to take into account technology. I mean, it is critical to assess the extent to which, first, technology-powered pedagogy is applied. Second, the fourth, technology is used to increase access and differentiate teaching approaches. And lastly, teachers know how to differentiate their teaching using technology. So I would say, according to me, that ICT and LCT go hand in hand. And for this reason, we really would like to assess to what extent LCT is implemented in teaching and learning process. We need to take into account ICT. So we're done with our presentation. I mean that we tackled a lot of things, the definition of learner-centered teaching. We talked about the element of learner-centered approach. We talked about the 5 practice areas that teachers need to work on in order to achieve learner-centered teaching. And we talked also about the role of ICT that I have just talked about. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any comment or question, you are very welcome. Thank you again.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor KARFA. Professor KARFA, Abderrahim.
Yes, Kibir.
Yeah, are we going to proceed? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Insaf and Ilham, for your presentation and for the efforts you have done to prepare this well-articulated and clear presentation. I think I will try to join my friend and colleague, Professor BELGHITI, and my students, just to clarify some points concerning learner-centeredness. I will try to be brief, and I would like that learner-centered and learning-centered approaches to education in general and to second and foreign language in particular. These approaches are rather, they are defining elements of education and educational practice. And fortunately, they have become institutional and policy-making issues. I would like my students to once again put these issues in learner and learner-centeredness in their theoretical, in their ever-changing theoretical context. I would like to ask them why and how the shift to learning-centeredness happened. How did it happen? We are talking about learner and learning-centeredness, which means that educational practice and theoretical and research practice before the emergence of this trend in education, those practices were not learner-centered and they were not learning-centered. I had the chance 2 weeks ago, while talking about lifelong learning, I had the chance to overview some major changes that happened in the field or that have happened in the field of education. So the process of teaching and learning and education first were governed by the behaviorist view on language acquisition and Bloomfieldian structuralism perspective on what language is. And of course, the process of teaching and learning within this perspective is considered as a linear process. It is governed by the stimulus-response relationship between teaching and learning. It was based on the assumption, on the principle that when teaching happens, learning happens. Another stimulus-response relationship defined communication theory, which was based on transmission theory. Okay, what happened? How the shift happened from this focusing on teaching and the teacher and the response, the stimulus response structure to learner and learning centeredness. Here I would like my students to understand the contribution of Chomsky, because it is not easy to make the link between and the connection between the contribution of Chomsky, because everyone knows that he worked and he is still working on syntax, on transformational grammar and generative grammar, etc. The contribution of Chomsky is so great. Why? Because Chomsky shook and questioned the foundational principles of behaviorism. And here I have a quote I would like to cite from Savignan, 1987, page 17. Savignan says, language teachers have known Chomsky to thank for his attack on the narrow behavioristic stimulus-response view of language and language learning espoused by B.F. Skinner. Savignan says, it was Chomsky who shook the Skinnerian theories of language learning, upon which the audiolingual approach to language teaching was based. Here I would like to say that Savignan could have said that not language teachers, but language learners and students in general have known Chomsky to thank. Okay? Because not teachers, because teachers suffered from the emergence of an unprecedented trends in education and teaching and learning second and foreign languages. Another source of contribution, why the emergence of this focus and this paradigmatic shift was the result of the emergence of a number of disciplines. And I will explain why. The Speech Act theory in 1992 and the article published by Himes in 1962, this is his first article, on the ethnography of speaking, the emergence of pragmatics, discourse analysis, linguistics, ethnography of communication. These disciplines independent disciplines focused on language use, okay? On language use rather than language usage, which implies that they focused on learners and students as users of language in different contexts, different sociocultural contexts, okay? And these disciplines and the insights they brought about resulted in of a third perspective on language acquisition and language learning. That is the perspective. In addition to the behaviorism and monetarism of with a third, okay, or a third, which hopes that do not learn language simply as a result of their exposure to the language, and imitation and repetition of that language. They do not learn language simply because they have the language acquisition device and the context they are exposed to is merely an activator of the parameters, but learning a language, acquiring a language is the result of the interaction that the learner, the child, participates in. So here we have the learner, okay? So this interactionist view enlightened educators concerning the role of the learner. Another important factor, of course, which is closely the humanistic movement in education, and which is closely related to the sociocultural and political changes that happened since the very beginning of the 1960s. And I don't want to go to that into details. The shift on learners in education, that is, we prepare those learners for the future. The humanistic movement holds that the learner, the student, is a full human being. To consider all learners that cognitive, affective, emotional, whatever, and the personality, their needs. Okay, so this focus on the learner and learn means on citizens in sociocultural and political life. Okay, so that political and cultural context found for the emergence of this new trend in education. I would like to refer my students concerning the humanistic movement
We cannot hear you.
Hello.
We cannot hear you.
Yeah.
Professor KARFA, we cannot hear you, please. Sinki, can you please sort out the problem? Sinki, are you here?
Yeah, Professor. Professor
Yes, we cannot hear him.
Professor is no longer here. Yeah.
Okay, we cannot
Yeah,
hear
he came
him.
back.
Okay, go. Thank you.
Professor KARFA, the mic.
Do you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, do you hear me?
No,
Yes.
no,
Yes,
no.
yes.
Okay.
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear him?
Okay. Yeah. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was I would like to refer my students to Dabin and Orstein 1986, page 75. These two scholars state that the humanistic approach holds that the deepest goal of or purpose of second language education is to develop the whole person within a human society. Okay, so this focus on the learner, not as a passive recipient of knowledge, the source of which is the teacher, but as a human being. That is, he is not only a learner, but he is a citizen within a human being within the classroom. So the humanistic approach constituted an important ingredient and component of the context which shaped the emergence of learner-centered and learner-centeredness. And as I mentioned on the first seminar, that the 1970s witnessed the emergence of the concept of lifelong learning. The concept of lifelong learning by thanks to the reports of UNESCO and thanks to the discovery or the new discovery of Dewey's ideas. So these are some of the important elements and factors that I would advise my students to read about. I would like to provide my students and my colleagues with 3 definitions of what the most and widely used definitions. The first one is by Prim, 1984, 134. In this definition, Trim says that learner-centeredness is a process in which, so it is a process in which language education contributes to the steady development of the learner in various dimensions. Here we have the different dimensions and the variables. As a communicator, as a learner of various interlocking groups, as with a personal culture, which of course brings to the classroom. I will talk later. Personal culture, personal values, and understanding, knowledge, and skills, and beliefs. So this personal culture, beliefs, and values constitute of learners. They shape their needs, etc. This development, Trim says, leads to an increase in autonomy of the learners as their attitudes, understanding, knowledge, skill them to take charge of their actions as socially responsible. Here the term social is very important. Cooperative, but free and self-directing agents. Human agency, which is completely against the stimulus response perspective on language acquisition and language learning. The second definition provided by Prabhu, one of most known scholars who published on learner-centeredness, 1984, page 164. Prabhu says, learner-centered approaches are those which justify themselves essentially in terms of concern for the learner, a concern which reflects the teacher's sense of social, ideological, or educational responsibility. So here, once again, ideological and educational responsibility. This is why I usually talk about intellectual, pedagogical, and professional commitment of teachers is very important. Ideological responsibility for his client. Unfortunately, I don't personally agree with this notion of client because they are, I don't think they are. Another comment provided by Professor Mohammed Wakrim, who argues that 3 elements are essential for the development of a learning-centered approach. The learner, the process of learning, because the learner, and of course I completely agree with my professor, Mohammed Wakrim, the learner, the process of learning and the context of learning were not issues within the framework of behaviorism, okay? They were not questions because things were clear to them. The process is that of imitation, repetition, and habit formation. And the process, the relationship between teaching and learning is a linear one. When the first happens, the second happens. And learners are passive recipients, so we only inject them with knowledge, with correct habits of that language. Another comment holds that learner-centeredness approaches and methods emphasize a shift from concern with syllabus, content, and methodology to the learner and the process of learning. And the process of learning and the effectiveness of the process of learning depends to a large extent on different variables which may come together. Some of them, or most of them, related to the defining elements of the frames of reference of the learners, which in turn shape their expectations and perceptions, and the perceptions of what participation is, what the role of teachers is, what is the role and the link and the relationship that should or should not exist with teachers. And another part is related to teachers' frames of reference, perceptions, conceptions, and expectations as to what education is. What is the role? What is the role of learners, and what kind of power and role relationship that should exist between them, okay? And the third variable between all this is the gap between these frames of reference, between the expectations of teachers and learners. So, in addition to these shifts, there was another shift at the level of research. We had a shift from methods comparison studies in the 1960s and the 1970s to compare in different methods, which one is the most effective. At the time, they used the term the best, and I agree with Professor Karima. I will come to that next. The shift from methods comparison studies to systematic observation studies using systematic observation schemes, and to, by the very beginning of the 1980s, to ethnographic classroom observation and ethnographic observation schemes. Another changes happened, okay, is that on understanding communication, what communication is. Yes, we can go back to the developments in the field of communication theory from transmission to an integrated, etc. Okay, so communication became that process of negotiation of meaning between teachers and students. It has come to be defined as a process of give and take, two-way process, okay? Two-way process. And research has come to study classroom interaction. It has become classroom-based, not only classroom-oriented, that is describing what teachers and sometimes students say about what happens in classroom, but classroom-based using an ethnographic approach to research. Okay, so there has been a development on different lines and tracks. Sociocultural development, because societies, including ours, has gone through deep changes. Here I would like to ask you, we may reflect together, and I would like to share with you one of my convictions. How many excellent students, how many excellent, can we imagine, how many excellent students dropped out of schools and universities because of what I usually refer to, I don't specify, as the lazy pedagogical mind of and repertoire of teachers. Because it was easy to refer to a student as a noisy student. And here I have a section in my thesis on noise and noisy students and noise management, okay? And I always say that those who were considered as noisy students help to develop pedagogical practice and to motivate innovative research on pedagogical practice. So I would like to add something else, which concerns the relationship between formal and informal education. Just to be optimistic that learner-centeredness and learning-centeredness is possible. It works. And it is possible. And there are to recognize individual practices, okay, of many teachers, practitioners, textbook designers, teachers, trainers. Yes, it is not part of the mainstream practice, but it is an emerging practice, okay? And it has become an important component of policy making and institutional thinking. So what was not fostering factor in the past, the wide and deep gap between formal and informal education. Here I'm talking about access to education. The case in the 1960s and the 1970s and 80s in Morocco, for example, in our context, is not the case, is not the same context today. How many fathers and mothers, okay, had access to education? The case is different. Because informal education, the pattern education, educational practices at homes now is different. Now there is more communication, more interaction. Okay, so it is not the case. One of the main constraining factors of the application, or at least the application of the insights of learner-centeredness and learning-centeredness, has been the wide and deep gap between parents and their perceptions of education and formal education, that is between teachers. Okay? So the case is different today. We can easily see in different public places how people communicate to their children. And parents have found themselves obliged to develop their pedagogies, their educational practices to cope with the challenges that children bring about. Okay, the same challenges are the same challenges teachers encounter. So it is possible, but there are always gaps. This is why research on the implementation of learner-centeredness and learning-centeredness should take into consideration and evaluate and study and describe the constraints that may hinder the implementation of learners and learner-centeredness. Yes, I would like just to say that learner-centeredness is not in itself an approach, because it has become, in the past, let me go back to understand. We had two questions to define which approach or which theory to use. What is language and what is language acquisition? Language is a set of structures, it is usage, and language acquisition is, for example, in the framework of behaviorism is. Okay, so the learning and the learning environment, the learning context were not issues. They were not elements in defining which theory. A theory in language teaching and learning was governed by two questions. What is language? It is a set of structures. Okay? And we resort to see Ferdinand de Saussure and later on to Chomsky. Please, Mr. Chomsky, please, Mr. de Saussure, give us a definition of what language is. Then we go to see B.F. Skinner and we ask him, please, could you please give us a definition of what this was the case? Later on, no. We, to construct a theory, an approach, and like this, we need to define other elements. What is the role of the learner? Or what kind of context is conducive to successful and effective learning? And what is learning? So the learner, the definition of the role of the learner, and by implication, the teacher and learning and the environment. And of course, as Professor Karima stated in reaction to one of my students or colleagues' question, I think the term the best. Today, there is a general agreement among applied linguists, and I hope among practitioners as well. There is no best. No best. The most effective, the most appropriate theory, approach, method, technique, practice is that which meets the diverse needs and diverse groups of learners. This is. And of course, applied linguists and practitioners no longer believe in the use of one method. So we have to vary our approaches, our methods, our practices to meet different needs. And I think one of my students talked about diversity. Today, new issues new concepts have been introduced in the field of education to bring all these two together. It is lifelong learning, and we have started talking about leadership and teachers' leadership, and students' leadership. So new perspectives on learner-centeredness and learning-centeredness. No method is effective in itself or approach. Otherwise, we will fall within the trap of, once again, dogmatism, okay? Dogmatism, prestige, the source of which is usually prestige. When we believe and we appreciate and we prefer a method and we think it is, because it is prestigious, then dogmatism and confusion. And confusion, which result by the end to widen and deepen the gap between theory and, because we preach something we don't do, okay? Simply because it is prestigious, simply because it is prestigious. Yes. To talk about the Moroccan context, I have to say that fortunately, the concern with learners, awareness of the important and central role of learners and learning environments and learning in the process of education in general, language teaching and learning is widely recognized. And it has become an institutional concern and a policy-making concern. And of course, my students I can refer them to the proceedings of MATE, the Moroccan Association of Teachers of English, and its national conferences, which have focused since the very beginning of 1991, up to now, on the learner and the learning, and for policy making, policy documents, yes, policy documents, including those introduced by the Ministry of Higher Education or the High Commission for Education and Training. We will find terms and concepts of critical thinking, creativity, innovation, making learner at the center of the test, etc. Okay, so we find all the notions, all the concepts we have been talking about, and things are getting better and better. Okay, so but the classroom is not an isolated context. What happens in a classroom is shaped by what teachers and students bring to that classroom. And what they bring is shaped by their sociocultural context. Okay? So I would like to just add something else. Learners' needs. Much of, or most of learners' needs are socially conditioned. That is, the learner's variables, perceptions, conceptions, attitudes, cognition, expectations, etc., are shaped by the social context. But they are also the result of what happens in the classrooms, okay? What happens in that small group community. So how to create an environment? Nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. We will never be perfect. Teachers will never be at ease We are obliged to cope with changes, and we have to play the role of change agents at the same time. But we have to be aware of the mechanisms and the conventions and the dynamics of classroom communication to be in a better position to cope with change. And we need to manipulate some notions and concepts. Okay, our classroom practices, patterns of classroom community, and the affective and emotional relationship that we are expected to create, and how to bridge the gap between teachers' expectations and students' expectations. One of the suggestions, particularly in large classes in higher education, is to build up a certain sort of agreement from the very beginning. The first session should be devoted to the creation of an agreement, to the explanation of exactly what the course will be about, how it will be presented, how they will be assessed, what is expected of students, and maybe asking students what they think of participation, because some people, they think that participation is listening to teachers, okay? And in case they perceive participation as interrupting teachers and asking questions, some teachers may consider that student as a noisy one, okay? Learner-centeredness, this is the end. Learner-centeredness should not be considered as something which is prestigious, because there are so many criticisms leveled against learner-centeredness. One of them I will cite, which I consider an introduction to the 15th seminar. When learner-centeredness emerged and was introduced in the field of education, since then it has been masculine in nature, patriarchal in nature. It is learner-centeredness. Has it focused on or female questions? This is why the 15th seminar will be about gender pedagogies. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Professor.
Thank you very much, Abderrahim, for this rich, deep, well elaborate analysis of learner-centeredness. I don't know whether we can give the floor now to students and colleagues to react.
Yes,
okay.
Briefly, to be brief, because yes. It is 10.
Yeah.
So maybe half an hour and we close up.
Yeah. But believe me, it's very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
Probably Professor the number of questions that we are going to take. 5 questions, for example, or something like that. What do you think? Elkarfa? Yeah. 5 questions and then we stop.
Yeah, 5 questions. Okay.
Yeah, that's going to be great, I think. Yeah.
Professor, please, I have only a comment.
Yeah.
Don't mind. It's
yeah,
okay?
Go on.
Okay, so
sir.
Go on. Ask a question, Hassan?
Yes, Professor Sandy, please, I have a question.
Yes, go on, go on.
Thank you, dear classmates, for your presentation. Thank you, professors, all professors, for your efforts, for having got this initiative. Briefly speaking, Professor Elkarfa, we can understand the connection, the relation between constructivism and learner-centered approach. We can understand the relationship between socio-constructivism and learner-centered approach. But you have mentioned that speech act theory is one of the theories that have paved the ground for learner-centered approach. And we would like you to elaborate more on that, please. The connection between speech act theory and learner-centered approach. Thank you.
Professor Karfa.
I think CTB.
I will react to all questions at the same time.
Okay,
Yes.
second question.
Yeah, you take
Iman.
Okay, I just have a comment. I think now this is my personal view as a student. Now I asked Professor BELGHITI earlier a question which was, what can help the teachers know that students are progressing in their learning? And she said that we can do so through continuous assessment, through reports, through assignments, etc. And Professor KARFA said that the students dropping out of school can occur because of the lazy pedagogies that professors tend to opt for. Now, personally speaking, I think that this is not the only reason, but because there are a lot of reasons. One of them is because of the wrong curriculum that is taught in the classrooms. Now, I guess it is important to implement lifelong learning courses in the classrooms in order to teach students what they can apply outside the classrooms. It's not about the number of assignments, it's not about the number of reports, it's not about the number of readings, but what those readings are about. As Katie Martin, who is the author of Learner-Centered Innovation, said that when we tell learners to complete an assignment, now we get compliance. But when we empower learners to investigate how to make an impact on the world, we inspire problem solvers and innovators. And this is important because I guess the lifelong learning courses that are implemented in European universities like career guidance, etc., are very important to take into account and to implement in the classrooms, and to take the needs analysis also very seriously, because students have different strengths, different needs, different motives, etc. Yes, this is just my personal point of view as a student. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Third question or comment or?
Yes, Professor Sally, if you allow me, please.
Yeah.
I would like just to react to what Iman said, and also to what our colleague, Professor Elkarfa, has actually presented in his intervention. When he talked about the first meeting between the students and the teacher, and the course description. I mean, the way the course is designed, the objective of the course, the procedure, how the teacher will proceed, the learning outcomes, and also other things. All these things contribute to what Imani are talking about. Because the assignment, the reports, the presentations, all those things we have are all contributing at the same time to bring to view those active learner, what Professor refers, student citizens who is capable of dealing with issues in real life and in society. Okay. So it is, as Professor Kofa mentioned, there is no best way of dealing with it, but it's this flexibility and this adaptation to the context, to the needs of the students, and to the needs of what you expect from those students to do when they complete their studies, what will determine those strategies we use in this language learning-centered approach. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sandy. This is just a clarification.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. The fourth question or comment.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Slawi, and thank you very much, Professor Sandy. Regarding the learner-centered teaching, the well-being of learners is given much importance. I would refer also to the relevance. What do you think about the well-being of teachers? How should it be dealt with within the top-down circulars and ministerial circles that put all its weight on the teacher? Of course, this is leading to less power of the teacher. And as we know that someone who has not power, of course, and who has not enough managerial and decision-making force will not have also the privileges and opportunities to be an agent of change himself or herself. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question, please.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes,
Last
sir.
question.
Yes, Professor Cindy.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, dear professors. Thank you so much, Professor BELGHITI, for your very interesting PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, my friends, dear friends, for your hard work. And my question was about, Professor KARFA has talked about classroom interaction, and I was wondering whether or not can we consider classroom interaction as a part of the learning-centered approach or not? Can we consider it as a part of it or not? And thank you so much.
Yeah. Professor BELGHITI, Professor KARFA.
Okay. Yes, you give the floor to Karima.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Karima.
Yes, Karima.
Yes, I would like to react to the last question on is interaction part of the learner-centered approach. Yes, it is. There is focus on a lot of teamwork. There's a focus on a lot of collaborative work. The only way for this to happen is through interaction. Interaction between us and between the students, and interaction between the students or among the students themselves. So we need to always maximize any learning activities or tasks that would maximize interaction. And of course, we need to always, before doing that, we need to set the objectives. What is the objective behind involving students in any type of interaction? Yes, so this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much.
Just to, yes?
I
Yes, you're
said,
welcome. You're welcome. Yes, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Karima. Yes, Kibir.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yes,
That's your
Kibir.
turn.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you, Professor Karima. Yeah, for the speech act theory. The first question is the relationship between the speech act theory and the learner-centeredness. Okay, after the revolution of Chomsky and the innovations he brought about, particularly in language acquisition, and the criticisms he leveled against behaviorism. Okay, the first, or one of the first books published at a moment when Chomskyan ideas were so prestigious and dominant was the first one in 1962, okay, was the book of Austin, How to Do Things with Words. That is, we use language to do something. That is the focus on another aspect of language, which is language use, the functional aspect of language. okay, the functional aspect of language. And How to Do Things with Words of Austin set the ground for the emergence, once again, set the ground and enlightened the emergence of sociolinguistics and of discourse analysis and Halliday's epistemic functionalism and other disciplines which focused on language use. When talking about language use, we talk about the language user, okay? And we talk about different contexts. We don't talk about linguistic competence, that is the rules of grammar that everybody knows. But we talk about diverse users and diverse texts. And we talk about appropriateness, that is the use of language in different contexts by different users appropriately. Not correctly, but appropriately in different contexts. So this paved the way of thinking about the learner, and paved the way for appropriateness rather than puracy, respect of grammar rules. Okay? How to do things with words paved the way for thinking of what we today refer to as X-based theories. Okay? X-based theories. How to do things with words constituted an important component of the theoretical context, the academic context that paved the way or shaped the emergence, the interactionist perspective, okay, on language acquisition and language. When here I shift to another, the relationship between interaction and learner-centeredness. When talking about classroom interaction, we talk about the nature of classroom communication. And it should be interactive. And the students should participate in classroom interactive communication. So communication was not governed by the stimulus response, or was not considered, or was no longer considered as a linear, automatic, mechanic relationship between teaching, between the sender, the producer, the stimulus, and the receiver, who is the learner. By definition, interaction and classroom interaction, by definition, is learner-centered and learner-centered as well. So the focus shifted to the learner because he or she has to participate in interactive communication in order to learn the language. That is, languages are better learned and developed through the learner's participation. And learners learn from interactive communication in which they participate. And this was made at a time, I think in 1974, by Widow-San, who said that communication is a methodological matter. That is, it is a matter of classroom activities and patterns of communication. It has nothing to do with content. That is the syllabus, even because the first draft, I didn't want to talk about communicative language teaching in the first draft, functional, situational syllabuses, okay? Widow-San reacted immediately to that. So remember that the speech act theory was an important component of the theoretical context that shaped the emergence of the integrative view or perspective on classroom communication, and contributed to the emergence of the interactionist approach to language teaching and learning. Another, the first meeting, yes, for the first meeting between teachers and students, this is just a one of the suggestions that is, you know, that I think we can do it. I know that there are different stakeholders who decide about education, about the program, about the classrooms, the size of the class, etc. But something that I think we can do is to introduce that module, its component, and to talk about life in that community. This doesn't mean that it's enough. And I didn't want to talk about the role of teachers as facilitators, as animators. Teachers who has come to be considered to fulfill that role, some sort of politician. And these are some arguments presented by Lassen Freeman and, Lassen Freeman and Vallier. They are not mine. They talk about the teacher as a politician. That is a sensitive theory. They should be sensitive to that context, which is ever changing. And they suggest that they have to conduct action research, of course, and to be reflective, that is teachers and change agents, and they cannot do that if they are backed up by their own. Why intellectual? I focus on that intellectual curiosity, that intellectual commitment, because I know without it, it becomes difficult to introduce change and to help our students, because it's easy to complain. Okay, I remember the wish or the dream of Professor Mohamed Wakrim. Yes, you attended when he was honored, I think 4 years ago. He said, my dream is that to see our students learn in the best possible conditions, the most effective possible conditions. That's all. And here, the last question about the well-being of, I think the well-being of teachers and learners. And I like this well-being. Yeah, the well-being of teachers and learners. Yes, the well-being or life of both teachers and learners in the classroom, their life in their institutions, their well-being in institutional and personal well-being is very important, okay? Because change doesn't depend on teachers. Introducing and implementing change does not depend on teachers, but different stakeholders should have the willing, the readiness, and voluntariness to introduce change, okay? I don't want to talk about it, please, because it is not the mode to criticize, but I think things are getting better, okay? It is professional to say that work conditions we are in are not good, are not conducive, are not encouraging, are not. This is why at least the solution for teachers to be satisfied and to cope with the difficulties they encounter, etc., is to be happy, to be proud of their missions, and to have that intellectual commitment to serve students, okay? And of course, I have been in leadership positions for at least 15 minutes in councils of the university, the faculty, etc. I have been talking about this, the well-being of teachers and the well-being of learners. So I hope things will be better in the future. But we have to, not we must. We should maybe. That is, it is the appropriate thing to do, is to do our best to serve our students. We don't have a choice. Personally, I'm happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you know, I have to find. We have to find a source of happiness anyway, a source of well-being. If it is not concrete and the conditions, etc. So it is a psychological happiness. It is intellectual. It is. And we are lucky anyway. We are working in this in education. It's good. It is a noble mission anyway. We do our best to kamal Allah. I hope I have satisfied the assessment because Professor Karima and Professor Bouziane have done great job concerning assessment, but there is no perfect criteria. There are no perfect criteria to assess because we have quantitative assessment and we have qualitative. We should have qualitative criteria to evaluate. Personally, I think when students do some efforts themselves, of course, under the guidance and the insights and of teachers, to pick up, to do some readings, okay? To do some readings, to pick up some pieces of information, to bring them together and to make them fit within one presentation or within one report, for me, it's good because it is at least one of the implications of lifelong learning, okay? Of lifelong learning. That is, they have done some efforts to bring up different perspectives, different pieces of information, pieces of knowledge, and they articulate them, re-articulate them, reformulate their phrases, sentences, etc., etc. Okay, that's good, and we have been changing anyway. We should be happy, at least concerning learner-centeredness. Many students have been doing their presentations online, and we have coping with the difficulties, psychological, those with the infrastructure, etc., and we have been managing. This is learner-centeredness, part of it. Teachers and students are together, talking, debating. It's good. It's good. We are on the right track. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Slawi. The floor and Professor Sandy, Professor Karima, and all my colleagues. Today, I will not mention the names, although, yes, I would like, just remember Yusuf Tamer from Agadir, some Professor Amtran, and many others. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Professor Amin, who is following us from America, Marshall University, and all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I would like to finish on this point of optimism. That's what keeps us, that's what keeps us going on. You know what I mean here. When you work, when we feel, when you find your colleagues doing initiatives like this, I feel happy. It's 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. I'm sorry to detain until this, but I feel glad. I see you. I talk with you. I communicate with you, and I communicate also with my students. So I miss a lot. You know what I mean? That's what keeps us. What I'm going on. But to think of other things, I think it's not the right time, and I think it will not help us go further in our life, not only just in our career, but also in our life. I have learned that there are challenges in life, that's for sure. In anything, there are challenges, but we have to fight, we have to struggle, and sometimes we have just to say, as you said, you know what I mean, yeah? And I agree. I would like to, I'm very glad because today, I'm not saying that the other webinars are, but today I attended very great talks, and I'm very happy. I will go to bed happy because Professor Karima, Professor Elkarfa gave a very deep and insightful, and this makes me I don't want to intervene because there are many. That's what we are here for, debatable issues. Because I was thinking of an eclectic approach. You know what? When you talked about the idea that we cannot put one method. This is learning-centered, and I agree with you completely. You know what I mean? Yeah. So what about putting together, you know, many approaches, you know, because our aim is to be effective. And that's what I learned, you know what I mean here, is effectiveness, efficacy, naja'a. That's what I have learned. Thank you very much. I will not, because if we continue talking about that, I will not stop. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Elkarfa, for having given me the honor to be a moderator. I hope that I have done a good job. I'm very happy to be with you today, and I hope I will continue with you whenever you like. I would like also to thank Professor Slawi, who has led, you know, the Master of Applied Language and Research in Higher Education with too much effort and with too much strength and too much will. So I would say thank you and see you next time.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.